Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce the final plenary panel for the day. The topic of today's discussion is global community forging ahead with international climate action. Really lucky to have a very distinguished panel for this session. I wanted to start with my colleague across the way, Dirk Forrester, who, as many of you know, is the president and CEO of the International Emissions Trading Association. Thank you, Dirk. To his right is Jennifer Haverkamp, Special Representative for Environment and Water Resources at the U.S. Department of State. And let me be very clear, she held that position until noon on January 20th. So just so you know which administration she represented.
Sorry.
We have Dr. Rodolfo Lassi, Undersecretary of Policy, Environment, and Environmental Planning at Semarnat in Mexico, and also a distinguished board member for the Climate Action Reserve. And to my immediate left is Diane Regas, the Executive Director of the Environmental Defense Fund. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Wanted to pose sort of one of my initial questions to get this discussion going, because we've heard so much about what's happening internationally. Obviously heard from the last speaker, Senator De Leon, and others about the challenges that are facing us. But as we've heard, there has been significant progress on climate since Paris. We talked about the Kigali Agreement, CORSIA. There have been other actions as well. For each of you, what do you think has been the most noteworthy accomplishments since Paris? And correspondingly, what's been the greatest disappointment? Who wants to go?
Ladies first.
Okay, or go ahead, Jennifer.
There are two ladies.
Well, I'm biased, but I think that 2016 was just an extraordinary year for climate change, and it's hard to pick which was the most significant. But I think the fact that we got Paris to enter into force in 10 months is extraordinary and sets so much of the table for the implementation of what we need to do going forward. The Kigali Amendment, with its potential to avoid up to half a degree of global warming, in and of itself is hard to say isn't just one of the incredible achievements in the climate space. I think the other agreement is great. But I think also what was a real accomplishment was that with Paris, we broke the great firewall between the rigid divisions between developed and developing countries. And we're able with that to implement more differentiation amongst all three of those agreements in a way that has made them negotiable. We are able to reach agreement on that and move forward. I guess my greatest disappointment is election
You're not
day.
at the State Department.
Exactly. I'm not still negotiating international agreements.
I think it's worth picking up on that because the magnitude of the challenges presented by the election of a president who doesn't accept the basic science of climate change is presents a challenge for all of us. It presents a challenge for everyone in the world who cares about addressing climate change, bringing clean air, clean water to the public, not only here, but in countries where there are millions of people who die prematurely every year from air pollution. And what the Trump administration does is going to matter, and it does matter. Our organization, Environmental Defense Fund, has actually never opposed a cabinet appointee in our 50-year history. And we made an exception for that for Scott Pruitt because he is so far outside the mainstream, not only in this country, but around the world. And to have him as Secretary of the Environment, I was at the Environmental Protection Agency, worked for Republicans and Democrats for over 20 years. And to have the head of the EPA, someone who rejects the basic science of the environment, who has spent his career trying to tear down progress, that is the biggest negative thing that has happened since Paris. But I'm not pessimistic, despite that. And I think Senator De Leon did a great job of laying out some reasons for optimism and actions. And I'm kind of a pragmatic, roll up my sleeves sort of person. And so I look at progress like just this week, Walmart, the biggest private employer in the world, announced the Gigaton Challenge, a commitment to reduce emissions by a gigaton. And EDF's been working with them for a decade to help set these targets and help meet them. Setting is a little easier than meeting. And just to give you a sense of how big a gigaton is, now there's more people in this room who probably know that than in most rooms I'm in, but a gigaton is more than the entire annual emissions of the country of Germany. That commitment from Walmart is building on the commitment of so many other leading businesses and companies around the world. To me, that change, that sea change in private leadership is incredibly important. The other sort of really positive thing I would point to, although I think we should talk about China a little bit later, I actually would point to the states in the United States. And California is fabulous. I live here. I love it. I drive an electric car. But I actually would point to Republican-led states in this country. State of Illinois, since the election, passed the biggest jobs bill ever, which is also a clean energy bill. Is going to drive billions and billions of dollars of investment. It's going to drive down carbon emissions in Illinois by 56% by 2030, which is way more than we would have gotten under the Clean Power Plan. Governor Kasich of Ohio, also a strong Republican governor, has vetoed legislation that would take Ohio off track in meeting clean energy targets. Texas, one of the reddest states in the country, is also one of the biggest generators of wind power because they've gotten rid of a lot of the rules that were in the way of it. There's only 5 countries in the world who generate more wind power than the state of Texas. So California is the 6th biggest economy. Texas is the 6th biggest generator of wind power. So a lot of positivity since the Paris Climate Agreement. Completely agree with Jennifer and would just add that those kind of practical things that I see happening around the world.
Allow me to rephrase some of the things that you mentioned, because when we talk about the CORSIA agreement, the example that the aviation industry made to the world is that they established the first carbon market in a global sense. No, it's the first international carbon market. Is the implementation of Article 6 of Paris Agreement.
Yeah.
So it's quite a successful thing. And regarding the Kigali Agreement, is also successful of the climate change science, because we are not dealing, in this case, with the 6 gases that are under the Kyoto Protocol. We are dealing with short-lived climate pollutants. So the IPCC recognized 2 weeks ago that we must address other pollutants that are affecting climate, and not only the ones that are included in the UNFCCC right now, but the ones that are also affecting our health and affecting ecosystems. And in the case of the HFCs are, of course, short-lived climate pollutants that are specifically regarded with some industries. But the agreement with China, the US and China, regarding this speed up the process of the agreement, and that was very positive, to engage China in a different concept of climate change mitigation actions. And also I would like to add that in my opinion, I think the most noteworthy accomplishment is the blossoming market of renewable energy. Not only in the offer, but also in the demand side. Because now we have the capability to produce our own electricity, clean electricity, and without any other negative effects. I think that this happened in Mexico, in California, Kevin De Leon mentioned it, but also in Chile, in South Africa, in Asia. And I think the renewable industry is now investing more than the fossil fuel industry. There are more jobs in this industry, and we are seeing a clear future about what clean means for us when we talk about energy.
Okay, it's my turn. Should I go or no?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm just going to pick up where Secretary Lacey left off, and I guess for me the biggest accomplishment since Paris. I mean, I'm with you guys on the trio of these amazing things that have happened, but I think for the business community, maybe the reaction of China to the Trump effect has been such a phenomenal thing, and the follow through on work on their emissions market, which I think will start this year. That's all the indications we have. It requires a heroic amount of work, but when you visit China and talk to the business community in China, it's very apparent that they're taking it seriously. They think it's for real, and they're getting prepared to participate in it and make it a success. And in global emissions terms, that probably matters more than anything else that's happened over the course of time since Paris. But we've got to see if the follow-through is really there and see what implementation looks like. And I think in terms of the disappointment, I'll give a slight riff on the Trump effect, which is I think for businesses that are active in this space, it's challenging to navigate this particular carbon world where you see these populist political movements that seem to be pulling people apart, whether it's the U.S. example and nasty things about NAFTA and things that we're going to pull out of that all feel much more isolationist. When on climate, you know that it's an issue that you have to come together on. We're better together. I think Minister McKenna said that this morning. We're better together. And I think that on climate, that's a real challenge for businesses to navigate. And Brexit's another example of it. We're having to spend time thinking about not joining ETSs there, but what are the potential options if it has to split apart. And it's not the direction any of us wanted to go, and we're going to work as hard as we can to urge continuity in that system and keeping it together. But I also think that perhaps this is the time that inspires people to rise up and rally around the importance of coming together. And you see that in a lot of the populist response and marches and things like that. But there's also an element of it, I think, in boardrooms where companies are aware that despite what presidents or prime ministers say about this, that the business realities are about cooperation and convergence and trade relationships. And for businesses, the climate issue itself is one where I think in this country it's really interesting to think about you look at the polling results. You guys at EDF do great work on this kind of thing. But you look at the polling results of Democrats and Republicans, and it's a supermajority of people that care about this issue and think that it should be addressed. So you have this weird thing where the politicians aren't lining up at least where the polling messages come out on it. So we have an electoral college that might have had something to do with the result we got, right? But businesses in this room that operate across the United States, they don't operate with an electoral college. They operate with a populace that has a supermajority that believes in climate action. So that combined with the terrific stuff we heard about in the opening segment this morning from the controller here about what the investment community wants, it's having a profound impact on the business community that, well, let's see, the government's dysfunctional, but our investors want us to get our act together and make sure we have a climate plan. And our customers, the large customer base, if you're playing to the masses, right, they want it. So you got to get positioned so that eventually the politics catches up with it. But I think it's really interesting to see how businesses are being forced to a place that's much more responsible, hence a Walmart, right?
Yeah. And Dirk, I think you're making a really important point about the public, that there's a tendency to assume that all the issues are just kind of split, Republican, Democrat, populist. And if you look at the polling, you referred to it, but I'll just shine a brighter light on it. If you look at the polling on these issues, it's not the case at all. That the latest polls show disapproval of the president and the administration's handling of the environment are at astronomical levels, over 60% as a whole, majorities in every subset. But I think the most compelling number in all that recent work is that among millennials, which is the biggest voting bloc, the growing voting bloc in this country, among millennials, 79% disapprove of what the administration is doing on the environment. That's by far the highest disapproval on any of the policy issues polled. And I believe that ultimately that is going to drive a shift in policy, and that makes me very optimistic, because ultimately, it's a democracy. What people want somehow shows up.
That's all a good cause for optimism, but we've dealt with climate skepticism long before Trump got elected. It just happens to be a little bit more mainstream now in our discussions. To me, one of the questions is, you've got this fringe perspective that only seems to exist on the far right in the U.S. The compelling rationale, as we've been hearing, is that there are just tremendous economic opportunities to be had to address this problem. If corporations are recognizing that, you mentioned the number of renewable jobs in Mexico. The Chinese get it. They see not only the environmental imperative, but the economic opportunity. That basic calculus of the number of jobs that can be generated and the dollars to be made, whatever currency you want to select, seems like it should be driving that debate more than it currently is. Why isn't that happening at a more public level and more occupying more of the mainstream thought that there's, we're hearing glimmerings of it, that trying to protect a coal industry employing 69,000 people is a government subsidy program as opposed to the 2.5 million clean energy jobs. That's such a powerful argument. Why isn't it resonating more?
So what if you're America's biggest competitor in the clean energy space? So you're China. And America says, I think we're going to just step out of this fight for a couple of years. And China says, well, we're going to invest hundreds of billions of dollars. We're already the biggest solar and wind producers. We're already building more solar and wind. We're already building infrastructure not only for ourselves but for our neighbors. We're going to drive our own markets. I think there's a lot of a competitive disadvantage that the United States is buying in this, and I think that actually is part of the answer to your question. Think about, now I'm going to reveal my age a little bit, but if you think about to the early 70s, you may have read about it in the history books, American car manufacturers dominated. And when the first oil shock hit, American car manufacturers were not ready, could not compete, could not sell their cars. That is what opened up the possibilities for car manufacturers in other parts of the world. Japanese, Germans, all grew their share of the market in this country and then ultimately elsewhere. And American car manufacturing has never recovered. And to me, we're reliving that history in clean energy. And I think that states like California and conservative states like the ones I mentioned, Illinois, Ohio, Texas, are saying, well, we got to figure out how to navigate these complex, what do we say about climate change, but at the same time, we better compete or we'll really lose out.
But let me tell you about the coal industry, because they are talking about clean coal. According to MIT, clean coal is the power plant that uses CCS technology, carbon capture and storage, perhaps carbon capture use and storage, as the Canadians are doing in the border in Saskatchewan. But are they talking about that clean coal, or are they talking about the clean coal that is not emitting sulfur dioxide or particles? Because if they are really introduce the technology to control greenhouse gases in the power plants, in coal-fired power plants, it's fair. If they have those assets, I mean, if the owners of the mines and the power plants have this technology and they will apply that technology to reduce their emissions and keep their business for the future, it's okay for us. Well, I mean, some environmentalists could say, no, it's better renewable energy than coal. But they are the owners of that land, of that resources. They have the right to use their assets for benefits. But what is clean coal for the new administration? I don't know, but it is part of the discussion. No?
I don't think it's obvious what the current administration is pushing clean coal, but your point's well taken. I think it's important to understand that there's no prohibitions against the development of an effective CCS clean coal technology, other than the fundamental economics. It simply can't compete with what's out there right now. So we could have that debate, but there's also been discussions, when they've interviewed West Virginia coal miners, or who used to be coal miners, what they were looking for. They're not looking forward to going back into the mines. They want to know what those next generation jobs are going to be, and that's the fundamental question we need to answer. I would think.
And you asked sort of why isn't that message getting through? And maybe it's just like there's a certain amount of repetition that needs to happen of, I thought Senator De Leon did a great job earlier of sort of emphasizing that. You noticed he came back to it twice, so that all of you got it about just how many more jobs, clean tech jobs there are in California compared to the entire coal mining industry across the country. But we have to, I think, get that messaging kind of punched up, and somehow I do think the American people kind of get it. That's probably, I understand we're in a slightly skewed room here, but so I noticed how many hands went up for electric cars, and if he had asked about bicycles and electric cars, we would have seen all the other hands up, right? So, but I do think that I think the American people are getting that. I think that message is getting through to the American people, and that's why I don't really know that to me the climate skeptics are sort of having their last hurrah here, because I don't think people are buying that. I think that's a few people in some very, very powerful places, but I don't think that's not where corporate America is right now, I don't think, and I don't think that's where most people are.
Derek, you travel the world looking at this issue. I'm curious, do you see a bifurcation between sort of U.S. corporate perspective on this and the rest of the world?
What I see as different is that businesses in the U.S. right now are trying to figure out how to navigate this strange political dynamic where you don't necessarily want to raise your profile on any issue right now because it's such a volatile atmosphere. But I think in terms of where they're laying in their investments, I hope I'm not offending any of my members that are in the room, but I do my little informal polls about what would it take you utilities to build another coal plant? Anybody interested? Anybody? What would it take? You'd have to pay them, and that might not even work, because to build a new coal plant, it's out of the money, right? It's not. It's with our natural gas prices and our renewable prices, it's not economic. They would get fired. Their board, their shareholders, they're not going to pay them to buy something that's uneconomic. And one of the most interesting responses I got was, well, we're not really interested in a 50-year environmental liability. Think about that. If you built a new coal plant right now, you're with it for a long, long time. And the direction of air pollution laws and climate laws aren't in your favor at all. So I think that I do think that we need to approach coal mining communities with some compassion and with some vision about that point you made about, I remember working for the congressman that I worked for in Washington back in the last century was from tobacco country. And he used to have a little game that he would play with his constituents, when they beat him up on tobacco issues and say, and this is about tobacco growers issues, how many of you really do you want your kids to work in tobacco? And he wouldn't get very many hands. They sort of saw the handwriting on the wall. They were trying to prepare their kids for a better future, for something more vibrant, for the next big thing. And I guess somehow I think we do, as a community, owe that to our friends in the coal industry to help those workers find that next thing. It shouldn't be a fight between workers about what the future should be. It should be looking for ways to cooperate and make a transition.
If I could add to this conversation, contrasting what we've been talking about with respect to the fossil fuel industry and public attitudes and industry attitudes to the other two agreements we were talking about, the Kigali Amendment and the ICAO Aviation Agreement. Those are agreements where one reason they succeeded was the very strong industry support behind them. And I think one reason why they are probably, there's reason to be cautiously optimistic that they will get implemented is because there is the industry support for them. And it's a mix, it's very much a case of their seeing their economic self-interest in going forward with these agreements. There's a U.S. industry that manufactures the alternatives to HFCs. But also the rest of the industry had 10 years to see this regulation coming down the pike and have made a big investment in the alternatives, in the different kinds of appliances that will use them. So they now have a real stake in seeing this agreement implemented and agreed to around the world. Similarly, I think it's really interesting to look at the aviation agreement, because that was very much driven by the global aviation industry, by the Trade Association for International Airlines, and then also with the support of the U.S. airlines. And there, it's a mix of realizing going forward that the flying public, the millennials, care about what mode of transportation is climate friendly, and they want to have an answer to aviation's contribution to climate change. But also, they were also driven by not wanting a patchwork of different regulations around the world. And when the EU decided to cover international aviation under their system, basically it changed the game, because then the government said that's an affront to our sovereignty, and the industry said we don't want a patchwork because we know we're going to be regulated. So they all went finally to the UN body to reach an international agreement. And we have the support of those industries in the United States, I think, going forward to get those agreements implemented. And you don't hear the same kind of rhetoric against them that you'd hear around the Clean Power Plan and that sort of thing.
That question of getting industry support to basically achieve your objective is certainly directly relevant to the climate discussion. You know, obviously gets a lot more complicated when we're talking about climate as opposed to the Kigali Agreement. But it does raise the question, if utilities are unwilling to invest in a coal plant, if the economics are definitely pointing the direction towards, gas and renewables, and and we've got it, in the backdrop of an administration that should be receptive to arguably pro-business or favorable business arguments, talks about renegotiating a NAFTA when a lot of these clean energy investments would benefit Mexico, the US, Canada, everybody. How do we get that perspective communicated to the current administration? Because there's a lot at stake here. Economically, apart from the environment, just economically there's a lot at stake.
Well, I think that's a message that the business community has to carry.
I think that's right.
And that is a place where these dynamics about what the Financial Stability Board is expecting of you in managing your business, making sure it's resilient against climate futures, you have to find a way to take that discussion to the halls of power in Washington and say, look, the investment community cares about this. We care about this. Our future business growth opportunities are going to depend on this. So, let's appreciate the importance of some stability in this area. Right now, I think it's probably everybody's trying to learn how they communicate their messages in this particular era. But you were asking earlier about how I see the differences in how companies behave abroad versus here. And one of the important things is, especially for multinationals, they can't tell separate stories different places.
We see it.
Oh, yeah.
There are these social media things that pop up, and you can get caught out in being in conflicting places. So it's very important to have a coherent sort of a policy approach on this. And so I think when it comes back to climate and clean energy and sort of stability of investment climates and all of that, I think those are the voices that have to carry it. It's probably not trade association guys, by the way. It's probably the real CEOs of the company.
And it's not environmentalists either right now. But I think, Dirk, you're exactly right that business leaders need to carry the message, and there's the economic case is there for them to carry that message. It's a complex political environment. One of the things that I hear from CEOs all the time is, look, I can't recruit people coming out of colleges and grad schools unless I'm taking a positive stand on this. And so I would say that for young people, it's important for us to elevate their sense of their influence. Because when a company is trying to compete for the top talent is looking at, well, what did you say about climate change? What are you doing about climate change? What are you doing about democratic values? Where does this company stand? And I think that has a tremendous amount of impact on companies, much more than maybe my kids are in their 20s. When they go do an interview, I know how they prepare, and I think they maybe aren't realizing how powerful they are, and that gives me a lot of hope that this will out over time.
But what we are seeing in the TV, for example, or in the films in Hollywood, they like the top runners, no? They like to have iPhones, electric cars, solar energy in their ceilings. That's the main message right now for the millennials, but also for us. No? If you're ambition something, what you are ambition, no?
Right.
You're right, no? We don't want to work in a mine, in a coal mine, no? Deep in the darkness and in a dirty situation. So, what is our ambition right now? What is the social ambition in China, in Africa, in the Middle East? No, what they want to buy, or what they want to be. Yeah. No, and in my opinion, the collective imagination of how the world will be in the near future is the
very powerful.
Yeah, it's a clean city with people walking, driving bicycles or using bicycles.
Texting while they walk.
Yeah. Yes,
Well,
doing selfies.
Less dangerous.
Yeah,
like
selfies.
this.
There we go.
Excellent point. By the way, we've got a number of issues to cover here, but I just wonder if there are any questions from the audience at the moment. If I could see anybody actually raising a hand. If not, give it some thought. We've got plenty of time. Well, some time. Yeah, Jennifer, I actually wanted to go back to something you mentioned at the outset about one of the major accomplishments is really how the Paris Agreement brought together the developed and the developing world. That clearly was an incredible aspirational accomplishment and has the potential to set us off on a completely different positive direction. It also has the potential, to perhaps be to fall apart under its own weight if we're not careful. I'm just wondering how each of you feel about what is it really going to take to make sure that we can maintain the momentum that we've seen in the Paris Agreement for collaboration, so that both developed and developing countries continue to, I won't say march in lockstep, but are committed to the same objective here, which is seriously reducing emissions here and creating a clean 21st century economy.
Well, I guess I would start even not by that bifurcation, but by saying, look at the enormous support for the Paris Agreement and climate action, that you had 120 heads of state come to Paris. When we had the signing ceremonies in New York a year ago, March, you had heads of state from all over. This was not, a few developed countries trying to drive this agenda. And I think that what it means then is that right now, the current administration of the United States is really anomalous. And I know that those of us who were there for the United States in Marrakesh right after the election, some of the developing country negotiators said to us, U.S. leadership has brought us to this point. We are going to carry on until you're back. And so, that's one way to look at this, frankly, is we are in what I hope is a blip. But that there's already so much that's been done, so much understanding and global recognition of the climate problem, and so much investment by countries who are on the receiving end of climate impacts. I mean, a lot of the countries who are committed to this agenda are not big emitters, but are really the ones who are suffering from the climate effects we're already feeling and that they know are coming down the pike. I think that in terms of whether China or the European Union can step into the same sort of driving and negotiation leadership role that the United States has often shown in the past, we'll see. But I think they're looking for ways to do it. And very much, I think, on all these negotiations, you saw stuff kind of baked in. Steps that are going to happen next that are already underway. And I can talk about that more if you want to hear more. But on both the Kigali Amendment and the ICAO Agreement, there is implementation activity underway right now. Countries already ratifying the Kigali Amendment, the efforts to start writing the rules to implement the aviation agreement. There's a lot of activity underway. Say with Kigali, Australia has already started to write the law to meet their new obligations. The EU has started their process of ratification. Mali has ratified the agreement. The Marshall Islands have done their parliamentary action. It's, there's sort of a show in the rest of the world of, we're not going to let what happened in the United States hold us back. We're going to prove that the momentum of Paris is still going forward.
I think for me, one of the most memorable moments after the election was I was in China in a small group with the vice premier, and those can be very formal events. And he was so passionate and leaned forward and said, anyone who thinks we signed on to that agreement because the United States forced us is wrong. We signed on to that agreement because it's in the interest of our people. And whatever other countries might do, China will meet its obligations. And to me, that was just such a memorable moment, and it underscores what I think is true, which is if the U.S. withdraws from Paris, which I passionately hope that does not happen, it would be so wrong for the world. I actually think the agreement, the Paris Agreement, will be fine. It'll be the U.S. that's isolated, which would be a historic turn of just unpredictable proportions. So I don't think that the collapse of Paris is something that is imminent or of concern. What I'm more worried if the United States drops out, what happens to the isolation, what takes us away from a seat at the table, what takes us not only away from the historic leadership role, as Jennifer so aptly put.
And if I can just add on that a little bit, it seems like you don't have to care about climate change to want to clearly see why the U.S. ought to stay in the Paris Agreement.
That's right.
There'd be such a diplomatic backlash after all the investment other countries made in getting to that point. I think it was George Bush's Undersecretary of State said it would be a historic mistake to pull out. And it's, I really hope it doesn't happen. It might, but I think that another example of sort of why you want this seat at the table is even if you want to rewrite the rules, you can't if you're not there. And that's why you're seeing some, even like Peabody Coal, telling the administration that they ought to stay in the Paris Agreement. I remember negotiating something called the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, and the U.S. wasn't a party to the Convention on Biodiversity, so it wasn't a party to the protocol negotiations. And the U.S. industry was completely out of the picture because we didn't have a seat at the table, even though the U.S. were the major producers and traders of genetically modified products.
But let me talk about organic foods, because it's the other side of the industry. I mean, now you can see in the menus here, in meals, for example, that you can have organic food, vegetarian food, vegan food. That means that those goods or products are also clean in some sense, no? And the carbon footprint of those goods are very low, no? Because if you go to Paris or if you go to any place in Europe, the most expensive restaurants are those who are selling local foods, organic foods, no? And they are trying to reduce their emissions in many ways, but it's a trending. It's like the renewables in the energy sector, no? Those are the industries of the future, and everybody wants to be engaged in this kind of new products, no? So we have different trends in different sectors, and some of the most powerful companies right now that are growing very fast are related with clean products. No? Talking about clean products as low emission products. No? And finally, I would like to talk about decarbonization, because it was a discussion in Paris. Do you remember? No, we raised the point that we must put in the Paris Agreement the word deep decarbonization or zero emission as a goal of the Paris Agreement. And we reached this. We find out that at the end of the discussions, the term that we will use in the Paris Agreement was a balance. No, what means balance? Balance in the Paris Agreement means that all the emissions that we will produce in this century will be captured or sequestered in the environment in order to avoid unbalance of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So we must reduce the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere, creating this balance. Know how to do it? With growing plants, putting this technology of carbon capture and sequestration not only in the coal industry, but also in the cement industry, in the iron and steel industry. And those are offsets, credits that we will manage in the carbon markets. No? So in my opinion, it's part of the new dimension of the climate change discussion. It don't depend of Donald Trump administrations. It depends of the trending or the triggers that are moving the industry right now.
So from my vantage point, one of the potential losses of the U.S. not being involved, if it chooses not to be, is in this area of markets that this event is so focused on. And the Article 6, which was a great achievement in being included there, is something that I know the U.S. played a role in ensuring that that flexibility was there, but I'm also struck by the fact that this agreement's kind of a different kind of agreement. This is a pledge and review system. This is one that's about catalyzing action at whatever level countries or jurisdictions are interested in. So in a way, even within the construct of the Paris Agreement, what's happening with California or with the RGGI program or with other states that might come along that can still contribute to the global cause. And we also have great advocates like Secretary Lacey there who will help us on the market architecture. And I know, and Minister McKenna, who cares deeply about this and was played such a pivotal role in Paris. But it is an area where I think over time it's been really encouraging to see this. There's kind of a subgrouping within the negotiations that focus on the technical aspects of this. They're continuing to work very hard on ensuring that those features are available for those that want to use them and that want to use them for achieving greater levels of ambition. And so I feel like that whole thing has such momentum behind it that it's unstoppable. Now, they can still screw things up, and we'll be there to urge that they don't. We'll bring ideas to the fore. But I do think that it's still an area where, the United States is good at markets. Good at market design. It would be helpful to have a constructive U.S. voice there. But at the same time, if the U.S. isn't there, there are plenty of others that are willing to step up. Am I right?
Yes, you're right.
Thank you.
The question is, what are those next steps? I mean, assuming that the U.S. just stays in the Paris Agreement, we all understand that this is a hard and arduous journey, and it's one we have to start quickly. What are the next steps that really need to happen to make sure that we can achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement? As we know, we need to go beyond that. I mean, it's one thing to feel confident that everyone's going to continue to pull in the same direction, regardless of what may transpire politically in the U.S. It's another thing to translate that into action, as you say, catalyzing action across 195 countries.
So this is the great thing about the way this agreement is structured, right? That action, at least in my mind, you might have a different, I don't see that action as, something that Paris is gonna, the Paris Agreement is, it's there to build confidence. It's there to inspire, and it's there to provide that trust but verify element. But the action is all in the NDCs. It's all in the nationally developed contribution. It's all in what Rodolfo Lassi and his team are able to implement back at home, because they've already made their pledge. It's whether they're able to follow through and achieve their highest aspirations. And so right now, that's one of the challenging things for those of us that work in the international arena on markets, is that the bottom-up world of carbon market development is such a challenge to work through, right? It's happening in your country, it's happening in Chile, it's happening in Colombia. There are people from Colombia here. It's happening in China, in Korea, in other jurisdictions, sort of looking at, okay, now we have this option available to us. How do we make it work for our industries? And especially as they look forward to the levels where things need to go, the cost of doing it alone versus the cost of doing it together, you're just much better off teaming up with others. And so, I don't know, I of course get invitations to all of these things about, and I know EDF does as well, the Carbon Club in Asia that wants to meet. Poor Secretary Lisi sees me a lot and will be seeing me more, but because there's such interest across Central and South America in how might we start to do things together in a market sense. And I don't think there's any holding that back, because the business community recognizes that, well, this level of action that's going to be required for us, if we do it in isolation, we're at risk of it costing a whole lot more. We're at risk of some anomaly that hurts us. But if we're teamed up with others, I think from a competitiveness business vantage point, they see it as, I'm not going to talk for 10 minutes, by the way. They see it as, we want to be able to access the same carbon price as our competitor in another jurisdiction. So if you're in a linked market, if you're in some kind of a club or a pool, and your cement industry is going to get to face the same carbon price as others in that particular pool. And it means that some of those competitiveness distortions, you can take that antacid and get calmed down, because it's not going to be as bad. You're going to be looking at the same price.
That's a great argument for collective action, but how do you pull that off? Not only in terms of getting different parties together, which, as I think as we all know, is difficult in and of itself, but then you're fundamentally dealing with significant different marginal costs across one economy to the next. I mean, we all know there's been discussions about, maybe Mexico will link with WCI at some point, or maybe other countries will come in, but the marginal costs from one country to the next are significant. And that raises a whole host of other questions about how to really pull off an integrated market, if you will.
I think you've got a hard job, but I think just expanding
we'll hold them to it.
Yeah, but expanding on sort of Paris's role and what the vulnerabilities of Paris are. I think even in the euphoria around Paris, nobody thought that agreement itself was going to be the complete answer to getting the world well below 2 degrees. And the design of Paris is, I think, really wonderful in that it's a framework. It's not, this has to be done by 2025 or it's a failure. It was designed to stop having regular new agreements negotiated every few years, so that countries set their targets, and every 5 years you review them and set another one. And so it's basically the frame on which this sort of incentive behavior among countries and clubs can hang and hopefully incentivize. But it's very much an experiment. It's sort of an interesting global governance experiment in, can we build collective action and positive incentives together voluntarily, not top-down telling countries what they have to do.
Yes, but if we talk, what's next? No. Well, first, we need to increase our ambition. The way to increase the ambition is involving the subnational authorities of the subnational organizations, and because they can contribute a lot in the mitigation process, but also in the adaptation activity. But what else? Well, we are preparing our portfolio of investments for the Green Climate Fund, for example, because there will be $100 billion mobilized in the financial global system. So how we can reach that money, no? And the way to do it is building a portfolio of investments in our specific countries. Do you know what is happening in Mexico? That we started to work with the industry and many sort of national authorities in order to have projects to present to the Green Climate Fund. But before we present these projects to the Green Climate Fund, we have to do it with the implementation agencies that normally are banks, private banks, or international organizations like the World Bank, the IDB, or others, no? Even some of the United Nations organisms. And they say, oh, this is a very good project, no? It's ready to finance. I prefer to keep this project for me instead than going and present these specific investments to the Green Climate Fund. So what is happening at the end is that the financial institutions are seeing the low carbon investment as a very good business, not for others, for them.
Right. So hanging fruit.
And this is a very good thing.
Absolutely.
No?
Excellent.
I guess I would add, and maybe this is a little bit different perspective. We haven't had enough disagreement on this panel. I think it's extraordinarily important in the development of carbon markets, which a price on carbon is going to be needed, whether it's a cap and trade system or tax or some combined. We're going to need it, and we're going to need to pass legislation in the United States to make that happen. But looking at the biggest one of these is under development now in China. And my organization has been working with the Chinese for several years as they've begun to develop this. And they put in place some pilot projects in 7 cities and provinces. Now, for me, a pilot project when I was in government was always, a few thousand people. In China, it's 150 million people were covered by the pilot projects. And all these projects tried out different models. And when China announces its emissions trading system later this year, it's not going to be like what we expect in the United States, where we spent 10 years designing and then poof, we're announcing it, it's all done. It's going to be announced and launched and start, and it's going to continue to need work for several years. What the reaction is in the environmental community, in the international community, to those steps forward, is it, wow, this is the biggest emissions trading market we've seen, this is fabulous, or is it going to be, we have a few things we'd like to see you fix? That actually is going to matter. And to me, getting these systems right in the individual countries as we begin to think about linkage, rather than leaping all the way to, we want a global market, we need to think about all the This is tough stuff. It takes a ton of work to get it right. It's taken California years to get it right, and the California cap and trade is working great. And still, there's improvements to be made. So I think it's really important in each of the countries to get these systems working, get them working well in that country, and then begin to build in the linkages rather than leap all the way there in one giant leap, because then we'll fall.
So one thing I wanted just to add on your original question here was about sort of the challenges of how do you get all of those things right at the beginning. And in thinking about the example that California and Quebec have given us, one of the things that I think has been kind of interesting about the evolution of that program is, so those two, and many of you in the room, worked through that WCI process, and they worked for years to get the right alignment, and went through that process of making sure the regulations were really well aligned. And it probably, I think I wish Jean-Yves was here, he might be, but I think the number was something like 7 years of development to make sure that before the linkage was consummated, that it had done all of those things you were describing, Craig. But when Glenn Murray did it, it only took a couple of years, because if you wanted to join that club,
The rules are already there.
A lot of things were already decided for you, and you were going to sort of need to measure up. And for Mexico, as it looks at that prospect, there'll be things to evaluate on that front about, well, maybe a lot of the decisions get simplified because it isn't an infinite array of possibilities, it's a narrower range. And I think that aspect of it, we could see that play out elsewhere. See, I see this in Europe. I live and work in London, and so I see, the Norwegians as they adapted to the EU ETS. There weren't that many choices to be made. This is the way it is. You're going to join the EU ETS. This is what you do. Switzerland's done the same thing, although they've never quite consummated the linking agreement, but for extraneous reasons dealing with immigration. But that's the way it's worked up until now. And so I think in this next phase that we go forward in, the conversations about clubs or about sort of joint action, I think, could actually get simplified a bit. We'll see. We'll see. It's one of the things that we're encouraging in the Article 6 negotiations is, so Article 6 has these basic accounting principles that are going to be really important for the integrity of the system overall. And we want that to be very transparent because markets love transparency, right? And then there's this mechanism that will be created that some think of as the son of the CDM or daughter of the CDM or some, crediting mechanism. We're thinking it ought to be able to be more than that maybe and be something where it could actually provide not just a unified system of issuing credits, but something that creates tools that could be used to solve some of those problems, like standardized baselines for sectors,
right.
Like a common registry service, so that you don't have multiple registries for that have to then talk to each other for getting transactions accomplished. That maybe have some standard approaches to MRV, so that step is simplified. That there are maybe there's an accreditation process that again is a standard thing that you could say, for accrediting our verifiers, this is the approach we're going to use. So we're trying to think creatively about that very problem, about how can we use that architecture to make it easier for people to get a good system up and running.
And I think you're already working on that, but some of those same questions are coming up ahead of that process through the implementation of the ICAO Aviation Agreement.
Yep.
And, how do you ensure that there's appropriate transparency for what the airline's obligations are and that they're implementing them? What are the types of offsets that can be used? How does it relate to son of CDM? I think those are all issues that are going to be really important over the next couple of years because a lot of what is being done in CORSIA will, for better or worse, help shape what happens in the Paris implementation.
Well, I want to thank all of the panel members for their contribution on this. It's clear that we all know we've got a long way to go, but there's a lot of very positive steps in place here. And despite the road bumps we may be encountering now, we are going to forge ahead. So if we could give a round of applause to the panelists, I'd appreciate it.